When I returned home for Thanksgiving with my husband, my brother pointed at the door and said, "You're not welcome here anymore." My aunt laughed and said, "Figures you'd show up uninvited." Then my dad added, "Let's just eat. Pretend she's not even here." I said, "No need to pretend." I turned around and left. What happened after left them speechless. Hi Reddit. I'm Celeste, 40F, and this story isn't one I ever thought I'd share. Mostly because for years I convinced myself none of it was as bad as it felt. But looking back, really looking back, I can see it all now. The quiet betrayals, the shifting alliances, the way family can close in like walls when you stop fitting the shape they want you to be. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania. Picture a place with one blinking traffic light, a church on every corner, and a population that hadn't changed in 20 years. My parents, Don and Margot, were from there, their parents were from there, and they expected we'd stay rooted there too. For a while, I played along. I was the firstborn, older sister to Damon, 38M, and Marley, 34F. Growing up, I was the dependable one. The kid who got good grades, came home before curfew, took care of things when mom was sick. Damon was always more impulsive, charming in a loud, pushy way. He was the kind of kid who could wreck your bike and somehow have you apologizing to him for it. And then there was Marley, sweet and dreamy and quiet, always looking up to both of us. Our mom held us together. She was warm in the way Dad never was. I used to think of her as the gravity of the family, gentle, but strong enough to keep everything from spinning out. When she got sick, I was in college already, 3 states away, and I came home as much as I could. But I'll never forget the guilt I felt when I missed her last birthday. She passed away the following spring. That was the beginning of the fracture. Dad changed after that. I mean, we all did, but his shift was colder, more subtle. He didn't shout. He just became more distant, and strangely, more opinionated at the same time. The kind of opinionated that came out in muttered comments and the clink of a fork too hard on a plate. He seemed to harden overnight. Damon moved back home not long after the funeral. At the time, I thought it was noble. He wants to help Dad, I said. He wants to be close to family. That's what I told myself, anyway. But over the years, it became clear Damon wasn't just helping. He was taking over. He started managing Dad's affairs, got involved with the family hardware store, and began dropping little comments in group calls and texts that felt off. Subtle digs. Well, some of us don't have time to run off to architecture school. Or, must be nice to fly home once every couple years like a guest star. It stung, but I shrugged it off. I met Theo, 42M, when I was 30. We both worked for the same design firm out in Oregon, where I'd moved after grad school. He's thoughtful and steady, kind in the way you can't fake. He has this calming presence that always made me feel like I could breathe a little easier. We got married 3 years later, and I invited everyone. Dad didn't come. Damon RSVP'd yes, but canceled the day before, citing store stuff. Marley came, though. She cried during our vows. For years, I let the distance between me and the rest of the family grow. Part of it was geography, but part of it was just easier that way. I'd call on birthdays. I'd send cards at Christmas. Every now and then, Dad would text me a blurry photo of something, usually his dog or the garage, and that was the extent of our communication. I knew they talked about me. I just didn't know how much or how far it had gone. That brings us to last fall. It was early November, and I got a call from Marley. She sounded off, tired, hesitant, like she was choosing her words carefully. "Are you thinking of coming back for Thanksgiving?" she asked. I paused. I hadn't planned on it. What? There was a long silence. Then she said, "I think you should. Just be ready. Things have gotten weird." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. But something about the way she said it stuck with me. After that call, I brought it up to Theo. He was surprised. "Are you sure? It's been years. And you've always said it's too tense." "I know," I said. "But I feel like if I don't go now, I might not go ever." So, I emailed Damon to let him know we'd be flying in. I didn't expect a warm reply, but I didn't expect what I got either. He wrote back, "You're coming? Okay. Up to you." That was it. No, can't wait. No, good to hear. Just a flat acknowledgement. Theo raised an eyebrow when I showed him. "You sure you want to walk into that?" "I just need to know what's going on," I said. "I need to look them in the eye." We flew out the day before Thanksgiving and stayed in a small inn on the edge of town. Everything felt eerily quiet. Familiar, but hollowed out, like someone had rearranged my memories with colder colors. On Thanksgiving Day, we drove to Dad's house around 3 p.m. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the yard. I stared at the front porch, the one I used to sit on with a book while Mom drank her tea. Now it was cluttered with boxes, old flower pots, and one of those seasonal doormats that just said welcome-ish. There were already several cars in the driveway. Damon's truck, Aunt Jean's unmistakably bright SUV, a couple of sedans I didn't recognize. I felt my stomach tighten. "You okay?" Theo asked. "I will be," I said. "Let's just see how this goes." I knocked. The door opened quickly. Damon stood there, arms crossed, eyes narrowing when he saw me. He didn't smile, didn't say hello. Instead, he said flatly, "You're not welcome here anymore." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I actually tilted my head and said, "Excuse me?" He didn't move. "You heard me." Behind him, I could see Aunt Jean lounging on the living room couch, sipping from a tall glass and shaking her head. "Well, figures you'd show up uninvited," she said, loud enough for me to hear. Then she gave a short, sharp laugh. I turned back to Damon. "I was invited. I emailed you. You let me know?" "That's not the same." Before I could respond, Dad appeared in the hallway, holding a plate of food, as if none of this was happening. He didn't look at me, just said, "Let's just eat. Pretend she's not even here." That hit me harder than anything else. Not Damon's words, not Aunt Jean's smirk, but the way Dad wouldn't even meet my eyes. Theo stepped forward then, gently touching my arm. I looked up at him. He didn't say anything, but I could feel what he was thinking. I turned back toward the house and said, calmly, "No need to pretend." Then I walked away, but I didn't go to the car. I stood at the end of the driveway, hands in my coat pockets, watching my breath curl in the cold air. My heart was pounding, not with sadness, but something sharper, a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about all the moments before, the silent treatment, the shifting loyalties, the way Damon had slowly turned the family into something that didn't have room for me anymore. And I realized something important as I stood there, gravel crunching under my boots. They thought I would just leave. They thought I'd go back to Oregon and stay gone, that I'd swallow this like I'd swallowed everything else. But they were wrong. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused at a name I hadn't dialed in over a decade. Someone who knew things about the store, about the house, about money. Things Damon and Dad never expected anyone to question. I pressed call. When the line picked up, I said, "Hey, it's Celeste. I know it's been a while, but I think I need your help." That was the moment everything started to unravel. The voice on the other end of the line sounded groggy and uncertain. "Hello. Hi. It's Celeste," I said, swallowing. "Celeste Harmon." There was a long pause. "Wow. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." "Yeah, I wasn't sure I'd call either. But I think something's going on. Something I should have paid attention to years ago." He sighed. "You want to talk about your dad and Damon?" That was all I needed to hear. His name is Mark Talley. He used to be the bookkeeper for our family's hardware business, Harmon's Home Supply. He was the one who taught me how to read inventory reports back when I was 15 and working the register over summer break. He left the store around 10 years ago. At the time, the story was that he'd wanted to retire. But the way he was speaking now, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Theo had driven us back to the inn by the time I finished the call. I didn't say much during the ride. I just stared out the window at the rows of bare trees, my thoughts a mess of past and present weaving together in new and troubling ways. Inside the room, I paced while Theo sat quietly on the bed. "What exactly did he say?" Theo asked when I finally stopped. I looked at him. He said the books didn't add up. Books? For the store? The business Dad inherited from his father, the one Damon helps run now. Mark handled the accounts for over 20 years. He said that when Damon got more involved, strange transactions started popping up. Expenses with no receipts. Vendors that didn't exist. Missing checks. He tried to talk to Dad about it, but Damon told him to stay in his lane. Theo frowned. "And your dad didn't listen?" "He didn't want to," I said. "Or maybe he just didn't care." Mark said he resigned when he realized he was signing off on things he couldn't verify. He didn't want to be part of it. And you believe him? I do. I should have seen it a long time ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning everything over in my mind. Not just what had happened at the house, but all the signs I'd ignored. Like when Dad had transferred the business bank account into joint names with Damon's without even telling Marley and me. He said it was for convenience. Or the time Damon got a brand new truck after claiming the store was barely breaking even. Or the whispers from Aunt Laura, Dad's older sister, who once told me over coffee that she worried about how much power Damon seems to have now. I'd brushed it all aside, because it was easier to believe I was the problem than to believe my own family was actively pushing me out. The next morning, I met with Mark at a diner 2 towns over. Neutral ground. He was older than I remembered, his hair now mostly gray, but his expression was as sharp and wary as it had been when I was a teenager watching him count drawer tills. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "I didn't bring everything," he said, "but this is enough for you to get a picture. Tax records, copies of bank statements. Look at the withdrawals." I opened the envelope slowly, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were photocopies of handwritten ledgers and digital printouts. I didn't understand every column, but even I could see the patterns. Large sums labeled contractor fees with no names attached. Equipment rentals that didn't match any work orders. Money leaving the account in chunks, then disappearing. Mark sipped his tea and kept his voice low. "I think he's been siphoning money. Slowly. Over years. And either your father doesn't see it, or he doesn't want to." "Why wouldn't he want to?" Mark gave a sad, knowing smile. "Because your brother makes him feel needed. Important. Like the business is still his. Like the family is still under his roof. It's the illusion of control. And Damon knows exactly how to keep that going." I stared at the numbers, and for the first time, I understood what had changed. I hadn't just become a stranger to my family. I'd become a threat. I left the diner with the envelope pressed against my chest like it was burning through my coat. Back at the inn, I found Theo pacing. "How'd it go?" he asked. I sat down slowly. "Worse than I thought. He's been bleeding the business dry, using Dad's name on everything." Theo sat across from me. "So what do we do?" I looked at him, my voice low. "I'm going to talk to Marley." I met Marley at a local park the next day. She'd flown in from Arizona 2 nights earlier and was staying with a friend from high school instead of at Dad's house, something I hadn't realized until we spoke. That alone told me plenty. She waved when she saw me, and I couldn't help but notice how tired she looked. There were faint lines around her eyes, and her posture was tighter than I remembered. She was dressed in soft, neutral tones, a scarf tucked up to her chin, and when we hugged, it felt like she was trying to hold in more than just her breath. "I'm so glad you called," she said quietly. We walked slowly, just a loop around the empty trail. I didn't speak for the first few minutes. I just let the silence grow, waiting to see if she'd fill it. She did. "They didn't even ask where I was staying," she said after a while. "Not Dad. Not Damon. I told them I had other plans, and they didn't blink." "I went to the house yesterday," I said. She looked over at me. "I heard. Damon's been fuming." "About what?" She gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You showing up. You leaving. You daring to exist at all." I hesitated, then asked, "Do you know about the business?" Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp now. "What about it?" "I've seen some paperwork. It looks like Damon's been moving money. A lot of it. Quietly. Behind everyone's back." Marley went silent for a long time. Then she said, "I tried to ask once. Last Christmas. I was helping Dad sort through some paperwork, and I found a folder with bank statements that didn't match the store's inventory. I asked him why there were payments to companies I couldn't verify. He told me to stay in my lane. Then he got angry. Damon called me that night and told me to stop snooping." She rubbed her hands together. "That's when I stopped going to family events." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't think you'd believe me," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You were always the one they blamed. The outsider. I thought if I said anything, you'd just think I was piling on." I shook my head slowly. "No, I believe you now." We stopped at the edge of the trail. Marley leaned against the railing of a small wooden bridge, staring out at the creek below. "They've turned the whole family into something else," she whispered. "It's like a performance. Dad plays the stern patriarch. Damon plays the loyal son. And anyone who doesn't read their lines gets cut." I reached into my bag and handed her a copy of the files from Mark. She leafed through them slowly, her eyes widening. This is bad. It's worse than bad," I said. "And if we don't stop it, he's going to walk away with everything. The store, the house, whatever savings are left. He'll have Dad's signature on every document and claim we were never involved." Marley looked up at me. "So what do we do?" I felt my jaw tighten. We do what they never expected, I said. We fight back. And just like that, the first cracks in Damon's little empire began to form. After Marley and I parted ways at the park, I drove back to the inn in near silence. I'd always imagined revenge as something loud and impulsive, a confrontation, a shouted truth, a slamming door. But what I was starting to feel wasn't impulsive at all. It was cold, steady, and deliberate, like a room gradually filling with water. By the time I stepped into our suite, Theo had already cleared the table and laid out my laptop, a notebook, and his own laptop beside it. He didn't ask what I wanted to do next. He just said, "Let's make a list." So we started. Every lead, every contact, every piece of evidence Mark had given me, every moment Marley could remember from recent years that had made her pause, every detail about the store, the accounts, the house deed, the vehicles, the joint accounts with Dad. Theo, ever the engineer, created a flowchart that mapped out how Damon had quietly made himself the hub of everything, how he'd spun a web so wide and dense that he probably thought no one would ever have the patience or clarity to untangle it. But here we were. The next step was delicate. We needed a witness, a neutral voice, someone who could document what was happening and, if needed, speak to it under oath. So I reached out to Mrs. Green. Her name probably means nothing to you, but in our town, she's an institution. She was the legal secretary for 3 generations of family attorneys. When her husband passed 10 years ago, she began doing part-time consulting for estate law, especially for older residents. It wasn't uncommon for her to pop by and help people sort through wills, property deeds, and the like. And crucially, she liked my mother. When I called her and explained the basics, she didn't sound surprised. "I always had my concerns," she said. "Your father hasn't been himself in years. And your brother, well, let's just say he's very selective with his charm." We arranged to meet the next morning at her office, a converted sunroom attached to her home on the east end of town. She was already waiting with 2 folders open when I arrived. "I've handled some of your father's paperwork over the years," she said, motioning for me to sit. He added Damon to his banking access 5 years ago, then to the store's operating account. A year later, the house was refinanced in both their names. It wasn't until last spring that I realized Marley and you had been completely removed from the estate plan. I blinked. "Removed?" She nodded, slowly. "He had a will drawn up in 2006 that divided the house, store shares, and remaining financial assets evenly among the 3 of you, with a portion designated for a scholarship fund in your mother's name. That version was updated, completely replaced, 2 years ago. Damon is now listed as sole beneficiary. You and Marley were omitted." My stomach turned, but I stayed quiet. I let her keep going. "It's not illegal," she continued, "but it's unusual, especially when there's no record of conflict. It's also troubling that Damon brought the new draft himself, and your father barely made eye contact when we reviewed it. That was the crack we needed." With her permission, I asked Mrs. Green to write an affidavit summarizing the changes she'd witnessed and the concerns she had regarding undue influence. She agreed. She even offered to help us secure a forensic accountant, someone who could review the financial records and verify whether Damon had been moving funds for personal gain. But she left me with one final question before I left. "What are you planning to do with this, Celeste?" I paused. Then I said, carefully, "I want to stop him, but I don't want to bury my father to do it." She looked at me kindly. "Then start with truth. Let the rest come naturally." Over the next 3 days, Marley and I worked quietly but relentlessly. We gathered everything: printouts, receipts, emails. Mark agreed to write a statement about his resignation and his concerns at the time. Mrs. Green sent over notarized documentation of the will changes. Theo helped us put it all into a single, organized folder with color-coded tabs and an executive summary. The plan wasn't to storm into the house and cause a scene. It wasn't to humiliate Damon in front of the family, at least not yet. It was to show Dad the truth. But Dad had become elusive. He stopped answering my calls, ignored my texts. Even Marley's messages went unread. We learned from Aunt Laura, the only extended family member still speaking to us, that Damon had told Dad we were trying to take him down out of jealousy. Jealousy of what? I asked. Aunt Laura just shook her head. "Your brother always did have a talent for twisting things just far enough that they sounded like truth." It became clear that a direct approach wouldn't work. So we came up with another idea: Thanksgiving, Part 2. We'd invite Dad to a quiet dinner. Just him, me, and Marley. No fanfare. No arguing. No surprises. Just a peaceful setting where we could show him what we'd found and give him a chance to see it without Damon whispering in his ear. We had Aunt Laura call him. She told him she'd like him to come for a calm dinner with his girls. He agreed, reluctantly. He arrived at her house 2 nights later, coat zipped to the neck, a stiff expression on his face like he expected an ambush. He looked older than I remembered. Not frail, exactly, but worn, like a man who had been living inside someone else's narrative for too long. Marley made soup and fresh bread. Aunt Laura poured tea. The air was heavy with silence for the first 20 minutes. Then I took out the folder. "Dad," I said, placing it gently on the table in front of him. "We need you to look at something. Please." He didn't move for a moment. Then he said, "Is this more of your drama?" "No," I said. "It's not drama. It's documents. It's bank records. It's your will. It's what's been happening behind your back, or maybe just beside you." He glanced at it but didn't open it. "I don't need to see this," he said. "I know what I've done." "You might know what you did," Marley said quietly. "But do you know what Damon has been doing?" That got his attention. A flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. He reached forward slowly and opened the folder. For a long time, none of us spoke. He leafed through the documents one by one. His brow furrowed. His hands trembled slightly. When he reached Mrs. Green's statement, he paused. "She said this?" he asked. "She did," I said. He turned to Marley. "And you knew about this?" "I suspected," she said. "I didn't want to believe it. But now I've seen it for myself." Dad leaned back in his chair. His mouth was a thin line. "This changes things." I nodded. "Yes, it does." And then he said something I didn't expect. "I don't think I can fix it." That was the moment I realized how deep the damage ran. But it wasn't the end. Because even if he couldn't fix it, we could. We had the evidence. We had the witnesses. And now we had Dad's out his first real crack in faith toward Damon. The next step was no longer private. We were going public. Dad left Aunt Laura's house that night without saying much more. He took the folder with him. Didn't promise anything. Didn't deny anything either. He just nodded once, slowly, and said, "Let me think." I watched him go with a strange heaviness in my chest. Not exactly hope, not quite grief. Just a quiet, aching sense that something had shifted. Not enough to fix everything, but maybe enough to start. Later that night, Marley sat across from me in the living room of the inn. "I don't think he'll confront Damon," she said. "Not directly." I nodded. "I know. But we don't need him to. Because now, we weren't just trying to make Dad see the truth. We were going to make everyone else see it too. That's how we came up with the idea. You have to understand Damon thrives on appearances. His whole sense of power comes from controlling the family narrative. He positions himself as the responsible one, the son who stayed, the one who takes care of Dad in the business while the selfish sisters ran off to chase careers in cities and lives elsewhere. He's careful about his reputation, especially in town. But his greatest weakness? He thinks no one's paying attention. So we decided to give him an audience. We didn't invite the whole family. Just the ones who mattered, the ones whose opinions Damon cared about most. Cousins, longtime family friends, the church couple Dad always tried to impress. About a dozen people, all told. We said it was a small Thanksgiving redo, a belated gathering since the original holiday had been a bit tense. That was the word we used, tense. Everyone accepted the invite. Curiosity, more than anything, seemed to drive them. Aunt Laura hosted again. She sent out the email from her account so Damon wouldn't suspect anything. Theo and I handled the logistics, catering, setup, place cards. Marley wrote a short statement that we planned to read at the right moment. We didn't expect Dad to attend, but we left a seat for him anyway. The night of the gathering, the house was warm with the scent of roasted squash and herbs. Candles flickered on the dining table. No one knew what was coming, not yet. We wanted the setting to be peaceful, calm, the last breath before the storm. People trickled in one by one, all smiles and polite questions. "Oh, Celeste, you look wonderful. How's Boston?" "Marley, you're a ray of sunshine. What's new in Arizona?" I smiled and nodded and offered tea, but my hands were cold. I kept glancing at the door. At 6:47 p.m., it opened and Damon walked in. He didn't come alone. He had Dad with him. They both looked like they were walking into a courtroom rather than a dinner. Damon wore his usual Sunday best press slacks, dark sweater, too much cologne. Dad looked uncertain, like he'd agreed to this last minute and wasn't entirely sure why. Marley and I exchanged a glance. It was time. The guests were gathered in the living room with plates in hand. Conversation had just started to settle when Aunt Laura cleared her throat and said, "Before we eat, the girls would like to say a few words." Damon turned his head slightly, eyebrows pinched. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Of course," he said, smiling just a little too tightly. "Go ahead." I stood first. I hadn't written a speech, but I didn't need one. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I know this isn't a typical gathering. Some of you may be wondering why we're having another dinner so soon after the holiday." I took a breath and let my eyes rest on each person in the room. The truth is, Thanksgiving didn't go the way we hoped. And it wasn't just because of a misunderstanding or a disagreement. It was because my brother told me I wasn't welcome in the house I grew up in. My aunt laughed when I walked through the door. And my father, who once taught me to tie my shoes, who told me to always speak up when something was wrong, sat at the head of the table and said we should just pretend I wasn't there. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Marley stood beside me now, her presence quiet but firm. "None of this is easy to say," she added. "And we're not here to shame anyone. But we are here to be honest. And to tell you what we've learned over the last few days." I turned back toward Damon. I used to think our distance was just personal, that we'd grown apart, that I was the difficult one. But I was wrong. Damon hasn't just isolated us. He's taken control of everything. The store, the house, even our father's will. Gasps, murmurs. Damon's mouth opened, then closed. Marley pulled out the folder we compiled and laid it on the coffee table in front of everyone. This contains bank statements, tax records, signed affidavits. It shows how Damon has redirected store funds for his own use, how he removed us from Dad's estate, how he's manipulated records, rewritten family history, and convinced our father to see us as strangers. A beat passed. Silence. Then Damon laughed, soft, incredulous. "This is absurd," he said, shaking his head. "You're embarrassing yourselves." He reached for the folder. Marley stepped in front of it. "Don't touch anything." He drew his hand back like she'd burned him. Dad sat very still. Aunt Laura turned to him, her voice quiet. "Is it true?" His voice was hoarse. "I don't know." Damon shot him a sharp look. "Dad, you know this is ridiculous. They've always resented us. They want to tear this family apart. I think," I said, stepping forward, "you've been doing that all by yourself." I wasn't shouting. I didn't have to, because the truth was louder than any raised voice could be. One of the cousins leaned in to read the documents. Another guest, Mrs. Crandall, who used to teach Sunday school with my mother, looked visibly shaken. "This isn't just family drama," Marley said, her voice steady now. "This is about accountability, about truth, about what happens when one person takes too much and expects no one will ever say no." Damon's face darkened. He straightened his posture, turned toward the door. "Dad," he said, voice clipped. "We're leaving." But Dad didn't move. He sat staring at the papers, at his daughters, at the faces around the room. And for the first time in years, he looked like a man who wasn't sure whose story he was living anymore. Damon stepped forward, placing a hand on Dad's shoulder. And that was when Dad finally spoke. "Take your hand off me." The entire room froze. Damon blinked. "What?" I said, "Take your hand off me." He did. Slowly. Dad stood. His hands trembled, but his voice was clear. "I need to speak to my daughters. Alone." Damon's jaw clenched. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You don't know what they're trying to do." And then, just like that, everything changed. Because Dad turned and looked at him with eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Sharp. Tired. Awake. "Neither do you," he said. Dad's voice hung in the air, steady but weighted with years of silence and doubt. For a moment, Damon simply stared at him, as if trying to decipher whether the man standing before him was truly his father or a stranger. Then, quietly, Dad said, "Let me show you something." He motioned to the folder on the table and gently flipped it open. "Everything here, it's true. I was blinded. I trusted you, Damon. I wanted to believe you were protecting this family. But the truth is, you were protecting yourself." Damon's face twitched with a flicker of something, anger, fear, maybe guilt. But he said nothing. "Celeste, Marley," Dad continued, his voice thick but clear, "I'm sorry. For not seeing it sooner. For letting this go on. I don't know how to fix the past, but I want to try to make this right." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Some guests nodded. Others looked at Damon with new eyes. Damon stepped back, defeated, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. The next few days were tense, but they were also hopeful. Dad met with Mrs. Green and the forensic accountant to review the finances. The truth was undeniable. Damon had moved funds from the family store into accounts with vague explanations. He'd refinanced the house without telling anyone. He'd altered the will. The evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the facts, Damon agreed to relinquish control of the store and the finances. He was encouraged to seek counseling for what everyone suspected had been a toxic need for control that had driven his actions. The siblings began to repair their relationship slowly. Marley and I helped Dad update his estate plan in a way that was fair, transparent, and included safeguards to prevent future manipulation. We sat with him for hours, talking about the past, the hurt, and the hope for a better future. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness is never easy. But for the first time in a long time, the family felt like it was more than a battlefield. It felt like a home again. The store stayed in the family, run now by Dad with our support and with new oversight. Damon's role shrank, and he was no longer the puppet master behind the scenes. He wasn't erased, but the power balance shifted. The house remained ours, no longer a symbol of exclusion, but a place we could all visit without tension. Thanksgiving, when it finally came again, was quiet but genuine. No laughs were forced. No one pretended. There was gratitude, not just for the food or the gathering, but for the truth finally spoken and for the chance to build something better from the pieces. Looking back, I realized the real revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming what was always ours: dignity, respect, and family. And in that, we all won.